Hey, what's going on, guys? It's me, Jay, here to do a video today on the sad news to report the longest reigning English monarch or British monarch in history, um, Queen Elizabeth II, who served her country for from 1952 to um, just now, has passed away at the age of 96 years old. Um, yeah, like I said, she was the longest running monarch in history. She became monarch. She became monarch after the death of her. Hey, Lisa, what's going on? She became monarch after the death of her father, um, King George VII, in the 1950s, and she presided over the throne until just now. Now that she's passed away, she has had many jubilees, um, many anniversaries of her reign, and like I said, she surpassed Queen Victoria's reign at the top, which Queen Victoria's reign was 62 years. Um, and previous to this, Queen Victoria was the longest running English monarch, and of course, Queen Elizabeth II um, reign on top England was a very controversial reign because it was during her reign that England proceeded to recede in power as a world power. England became less important as a world power. When she ascended to the throne in 1952, England was quite possibly the most powerful nation on earth. The sun never set on the British Empire. They had colonies in India, they had colonies in the Caribbean, they had colonies in Canada, they had colonies in the South Pacific, besides France, and I think they were even more powerful than France. But as her reign continued, of course, the United States after World War II became the most powerful nation on earth. And the United States, I believe, in power and influence, surpassed the British Empire. So her reign was her reign, and this really had nothing to do with her specifically, but her reign coincided with the decline in power and influence of um, the British Empire. They lost India in 1947. They lost um, much of the Middle East in 1948, especially Israel. Um, they just lost a lot of colonies, and recently, in the past couple of years, as Melissa and I covered in our videos, they lost influence over countries like Barbados, which have been um, tremendous crown colonies in Barbados, specifically being the first colony in the Americas that the British ever took possession of. So, um, just as Queen Victoria's reign or Queen Elizabeth I's reign in the 1500s coincided with the ascension of the British Empire, this Queen Elizabeth II's reign coincided with the descension or the downgrading of British power and influence in the world. Also, her reign is very considered very controversial because of, and this is covered in the video in the archives on the Netflix series The Crown, which premiered a couple of years ago, as far as how she treated Princess Diana of Wales, who passed away in 1997. Princess Diana of Wales was a people's princess. She was very um, beloved by the British people. She was a commoner who came into marrying Elizabeth's son, who I guess now we could say that he's not officially coronated yet, but he is now King Charles um, of England, formerly Prince Charles of England, right? But he is now King Charles of England. Princess Diana was married to him, and they had a very ugly breakup. In fact, he cheated on her. Yeah, and he's 72. He cheated on her with Camilla Bowles, as we remember in the 90s, and it was a huge scandal. And the royal family really ostracized, with Queen Elizabeth II at the head, really ostracized um, Princess Diana and made her feel like an outsider. And really, there's a conspiracy theory out there that the royal family may have had something to do with the death of Princess Diana. There's always been that sort of conspiracy theories. Uh, yeah, Lisa says she's gonna be the queen now, Camilla Bowles, and it's bittersweet for the British public because, like I said, they never really liked Camilla Bowles Parker, and they wanted Queen Princess Diana to be the queen, but unfortunately, that is not going to happen. Of course, and then Queen Elizabeth's um, royal house, the House of Windsor, came under more scrutiny in this era, in the 2010s, uh, because of how they treated Meghan Markle. Meghan Markle, of course, marrying into the family in 2018, an African American Duchess, the Duchess of Sussex, and it seemed like the family was, and it came out later on in that Oprah interview that we did a video on, that the family ostracized her kind of and made her feel uncomfortable and were responsible really for one of her miscarriages. So Queen Elizabeth was not really a well liked queen, at least here by the press in both the UK and here in the United States. Kind of seen as a outmoded appendage of British power, right? Kind of seen in a really negative light, in my opinion, at least by the American public and in the American media. But her coronation was the first coronation ever seen live on television. Of course, at that time, television was just beginning to be a thing, and there had never been a coronation on television, and they didn't even want to do it because of the formalities involved. But they did do it, and it was seen by the entire world. And of course, she presided over the country when the country was going through a lot of troubles the troubles in the 1980s that we talked about a little bit in the 1980s video in the archives, between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, in which um, the um, Protestants of Northern Ireland, which is still part of Great Britain, officially the United Kingdom is called the Kingdom of Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. It's still part of Great Britain, but some partisans, some Catholics in the country were trying to break away from Britain and become part of Ireland, which left the official British Union in the 1920s, and they were trying to become part of the Irish Republic. And there were a lot of Irish Republican Army (IRA) terrorists in the 1980s, targeting her and targeting her family for assassinations because they were separatists and they wanted to, um, you know, unite with the Irish Republic and break Northern Ireland away from England. So that was a tremendous hurdle that she presided over. Also, the 7/7 bombings in 2005 that had to do with Islamic terrorism because Tony Blair was the prime minister at that time, involved the United Kingdom in the war in Iraq, which was highly unpopular, especially with the growing Muslim population in the UK. And there was a train bombing in 7/7 in 2005, akin to what we went through in 9/11. Also, she presided over the country when the country was during World War II. That time um, she wasn't queen yet, but of course, we know the Blitzkrieg, we know the German invasions of England, the London bombings in the 40s that were part of World War II, and she was a part of that. And the Prince Philip, her husband, actually served in World War II. So she's been through most of the big battles of the latter half of the 20th century. She has been the monarch, and I think she is the longest running head of state ever in world history, not just in British history, but in world history in general. Um, like I said, the whole family is shrouded in mystery, shrouded in secrecy, so it's hard to really know what's true and what isn't. But um, obviously, long long live the Queen of England, um, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. She is definitely a monarch that will go down in world history. It's interesting that King Henry VIII, in the 1500s, split with the Catholic Church, and he wanted to annul the marriage with his wife because he didn't produce any male heirs. And yet, the most famous people associated with British history in terms of British, um, the British monarchy are the ones, the women. Elizabeth the First, obviously, who repelled the Spanish Armada in 1588, and um, Queen Victoria, who, again, like I said, presided over England when England was on the ascension, especially with global power in places like Africa and Asia. She was the queen during the late 1800s up until like 1901. You know what I mean? So we don't when we think generally of British monarchs, Elizabeth the Second has to come into play. Elizabeth the First and Queen Victoria. We don't generally think of William the Conqueror, who was the first officially British king. He was a Norman king, but there is yes, Lisa Elizabeth is her real name. She was named after Elizabeth the First. Elizabeth the First, of course, the Virgin Queen, whom Virginia is named after. She was the first Elizabeth. She was King Henry VIII's daughter, and she was the one responsible for sending out the fleet to explore the Americas. So the first colony in American history in 1607, um, was named in her honor. Um, and this Elizabeth is the second Elizabeth. So this is Elizabeth the second. Generally, when it comes to British monarchs, you have King Henry the First, King Henry the Second, King Henry the Third, who was involved in the Hundred Years' War, King Henry the Fourth, the Fifth, and then King Henry the Eighth or William the First, William the Conqueror, or there's only been one one Queen Victoria. Now King Charles is, I believe, King Charles. King Charles. This King Charles will be King Charles this. Um, he'll be King Charles the Third, I believe, because there was a King Charles the Second, the famous one that we know about from American history. We talked about him on the Queen video. He was the famous king who had the dispute with the pilgrims that expelled them, um, or not expelled them, but really had a dispute with them wanting to enforce the rules of the Church of England on them, and they were Congregationalists, and they chose to um, leave Great Britain in the 1620s behind that. So that was that was the second King Charles, and that was what eventually culminated, and that was the English Civil War between the Loyalists and the Royalists, rather, and the what they call the Roundheads, the people who believe that Parliament should have more power and that England should become more of a republic type government. And uh, for a while, England under Oliver Cromwell was Old Ironside, called in British history, was a um, a republic, but you know they didn't really like that, so they called in King Charles III, and he restored the monarchy, and the monarchy has coexisted with Parliament ever since. Britain is very unique in that sense. When I was a kid, I used to think that the British monarchs had all the power, that they were monarchs like monarchs really were in the Middle Ages, that they were absolute monarchs. But in England, that never really was the case. Even during the Middle Ages, monarchs were never really, um, they didn't hold absolute power. It wasn't like in France. When you had Louis the 14th, you had absolute monarchy. Every the king's word was his word, and nobody could dispute it. But in England, you always had this sort of councilship type government, going back to the days of the fourth and fifth century with the Anglo-Saxon um, Witten, which eventually became, when the Normans came in 1066, the Parliament. So the king's powers were always restricted, and then in 1215, when you had the Magna Carta, that was an official document limiting the power of the British monarch even further. And then it was expanded upon, of course, with the English Civil War. And you had this tradition in England of representative government alongside monarchy. Of course, the descendants of the Anglo Saxons, the descendants of the people in England here in the United States took it a step further, and under King George III, just abolished the power of the king altogether, and it was a sort of return to councilship government and the supremacy of councilship government, with only a chief executive in power, with the president. You never really had that in England. They tried it. They tried to do a republic for a little while, like I said, under Oliver Cromwell, but Oliver Cromwell himself, he just became a dictator. So they said, you know what? We're going to go back to the monarchy. And that's the way they've been doing it ever since. And they came up with the framework of constitutional monarchy, where the king or queen has certain powers, and the parliamentary government and her appointed representative, the prime minister, who they just had a new prime minister, you know, right now, Liz Truss put in power because Boris Johnson, ended up doing some corruption, and he was thrown out as prime minister. But it's very unique how the British government does it, and I think it is very strange in a way. But anyway, rest in peace to um, the Queen of England. Thank you for her service to the world, to the English speaking world, and to the country of Great Britain. Long live the Queen, as the British national anthem says. God, God save the Queen. Peace. Love you guys. Thank you, Lisa, for contributing.